Hello, everyone. This is Ankur Laroya. I am the Chief Strategy Officer of Flowsum. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be spending a little bit of time discussing why native matters, what native means, in terms of our perspective as Flowsum, as it relates to DevSecOps, as well as, Salesforce ecosystem as a whole. And so that's what we're going to be visiting about today. So let's talk about what native means. There's a lot of confusion out there in the broader Salesforce ecosystem. So a lot of vendors, there's a lot of products with this sort of native moniker today. And so the essence of the word native becomes misconstrued, and essentially, the hard-hitting context and connotation gets lost in that confusion and FUD, if you will. But as consumers, what I encourage my customers and prospects to really start to investigate as part of their due diligence process is, if a native app or an app really purports itself to be, purportedly, again, native, is it really going to run and live inside of their Salesforce instance? As in, can you access data natively, inherently inside of Salesforce without the use of any kind of APIs? Are you having to provide for separate encryption for your data as it's in flight or in rest? Are you the only person or entity as a consumer that has access, visibility, and control to your, again, DevOps data? Those are things that you should really start to look at. The other thing is, everybody says that, hey, we're on the App Exchange and life is good. Well, to be honest with you, this is a huge myth, because Salesforce lets anybody put, a Salesforce app on App Exchange. The amount of due diligence that is done is fairly minimal at best. And so it is truly incumbent upon the vendor to self-certify and the consumer to make sure that that application is going to be safe, secure, and well-built, all information governance. So one of the things you should ask is your application 100% certified by the internal Salesforce security team? Because if you're a native application, that will indeed be the case. So there are no DevOps backdoors, in our case, like we have with our competition. We welcome InfoSec reviews. If you trust Salesforce, you really, at the end of the day, are going to trust Flowsum. We're also built within Salesforce using the declarative development environment. So what that means for you is that there's very little OCM, that's organizational change management or operational change management issues to deal with. There's a very little learning curve. We have out-of-box integration with other native apps. And what we've seen in our studies is that we typically see between 3 to 8x improvement in developer efficiency. So that's what the power of native is and what native really means. So proof is in the pudding, as I say. There's a lot of people out there. You can see on this slide here where folks say, hey, they're native DevOps solution for Salesforce customers down there, but they're not really native because they don't actually have the native badge. So you can say whatever you want, as far as your app titles are concerned. That's really up to us as vendors, but it's Salesforce that does the adjudication and makes sure that, you get the native app badge if you truly are a native app. So you can say whatever you want. Pick on one of my competitors here who's saying that they're a native DevOps solution, but when you go to the App Exchange, what you'll find is that's not really true. So if you are in the market for a bulletproof, bullet-resistant DevSecOps solution built on Salesforce, look for the native app, and the only one you'll find today is Flowsum. So let's talk a little bit about why that's such a big deal. The reason why that's such a big deal is when you have a non-native app, what it essentially does is make a whole bunch of API calls. Between Salesforce's database, data is being sent back and forth to an external application typically, and then that application, then does a commit back into Salesforce. Well, you might be saying, hey, Ankur, what's the big deal with that? Well, the big deal with that is typically Salesforce limits the amount of API calls that you can make, number one. So if you exceed your monthly quota for API calls, you're going to get charged for that. That may not be a big deal, maybe it might. But then the other problem here with this architecture is that I call it my grandfather's architecture. This is really old and dated. You typically don't do this anymore because it leads to a lot of security vulnerabilities. It's in essence, anytime you're leaving the Salesforce walled garden and going out, you are losing control. The other problem that we typically, see our customers having is passing InfoSec reviews internally because they have to whitelist a whole bunch of IP addresses in order to make this type of architecture on the left work. When you have a native app such as ours, what ends up happening in that instance is it's getting data right from the database. There's no network to go through. There's no lag. You're essentially getting data in real time. And so, that there's no security issues. There's no performance issues. There's no APIs, period. So you don't have to worry about any of that overhead that you would with a non-native app. So why is this important? Well, the reason why this is important is because, there's kind of these 5 pillars that we talk about inside of the shop at Flowsome. You as a customer get better risk management, better compliance, you get better productivity, which translates into cost savings. But most importantly for developers and release managers and architects, this is all about job and organizational security. I am presently talking to an entity in New York that's having to completely refactor their choice of tooling, specifically because of risk management, productivity, and cost savings. And that team has had a bit of egg on their face and have lost credibility because they chose a tool that promised them the moon, but couldn't really get them off the launch pad. The other thing that we really like to hit home on here is that we have compliance that we inherit from Salesforce because we are a native app. Salesforce spends not tens of millions, they actually spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year, year over year, getting compliance and maintaining compliance with all kinds of regulations that are out there. And these aren't just native to the US, these are worldwide regs as well. And so because we are a native application, we inherit those, and we inherit them, exclusively because of the way that we're built on the Salesforce platform. So when you start to look at, the 4 major players out there on the ecosystem, you look at on the left-hand side how many, compliance regimes and mandates Flowsome complies with versus, kind of the other folks that are in this ecosystem competing for essentially the same share of wallet that we are. And so you might be thinking, well, I'm in manufacturing and I only care about, for example, ISO certification. Why would I care about something like HIPAA or GDPR or HITRUST, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the thing is, you want to go with a provider that's actually inheriting a lot of different mandates and certifications because you're providing for, at that point, a 360-degree envelope of compliance. That is super important, even though HIPAA may not matter to you, but a lot of the procedures, processes, and the way that your data is shielded is essentially the same. And so that's important. And so that's one of the big reasons why you should care. The other thing that's interesting today is data residency. And so we live wherever Salesforce lives, and we abide by data residency rules that most geographies and countries have at this point. A lot of our competitors can't do this because they're not native to Salesforce. And so the way that data will get to their platforms is scattershot all across the internet. If any of you know, which I'm pretty sure you do, how the transmission control protocol and internet protocol, that's TCP, work, unless you're in the same walled garden, your data goes here, there, and everywhere. And we talk about the fact that, hey, my data is HTTPS, so it's fine. I don't worry about it, but actually you really should, because HTTPS is definitely very hackable. And so the big piece here to take home is that you want to go with a provider that has native capabilities to Salesforce, because wherever your Salesforce org is where we're going to live. We're not going to put your data in a data center in the US if you're in Europe, or if you're in Asia. We are essentially inside of the Salesforce runtime. And so we completely abide by data residency, unlike the other folks. The other thing that's interesting is beyond compliance, you have all these new privacy laws that are coming up, right? The biggest one is GDPR, and then you've got CAPA, in California. And as you can see, this is not just a Europe or a US thing, this is a global thing. And so a big problem that my customers, especially those that are in the banking and manufacturing verticals, as well as energy, are starting to experience is with regards to compliance and privacy. Their tooling is all of a sudden getting them out of compliant, because it was never really designed or built with these types of compliancy requirements in mind. Whereas with us, we've built this tool from the ground up. We haven't just cobbled a bunch of things together loosely and made things kind of sort of work. And so this is, again, a dedicated solution where you are going to inherit a lot of compliance and a lot of privacy, because Salesforce inherently is doing all of the heavy lifting and making the investment in making sure that they're compliant. And since we are a part of their native ecosystem running inside of their world, their universe, we inherit those. And so that lets us punch considerably way beyond our weight. So let's talk a little bit, we've talked about compliance, we've talked about privacy. The other leg of that stool is security. So let's talk a little bit about security. With us, your data is going to stay, as I've said, within the Salesforce, sort of operating system, the Salesforce walled garden. We are built on Salesforce.com. We use 100% Salesforce objects. Most standard, some custom, obviously, because we are a solution on top of the Force.com platform. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, we are 100% coded within Salesforce. We're not like the other guys where we've got, as I call it, Franken code, where some of it's coded in C#, some of it's coded, in Apex, and we're trying to move from one computing platform to another. In the middle of all of that. We don't play that game. We have built our tooling and our solutions 100% on Salesforce, which again gives us all the advantages that we have been talking about. The other thing around security is that we don't sit there and try to persist security, which is very, very tough when you are not built inside of Salesforce. Salesforce, as you can see on the right-hand side, gets an A rating from, UpGuard. We use all of Salesforce's inherently native security. And so that's all the way from the org level down to the record level, inclusive of the ability to do monitoring, audits, and tracking. The reason why that's important is because we don't have another database, which translates into overhead for you guys as consumers. We don't have that. We use all of Salesforce's security protocols that are built into Salesforce. We don't try to mirror them. We don't try to sit there and do tokenization and weird things like that that are no longer, quite frankly, acceptable by InfoSec teams. We have no backdoors, by the way. Most of the other vendors out there today will have you open IP addresses, as I was mentioning earlier, which then lead to backdoors and security holes, which typically have a hard time getting passed by your own native InfoSec teams. And we also, this is really important, is we use Salesforce's native app review. And a lot of times when I visit with you folks, in person, people typically ask me what that means. What that means is that in order to get that native badge, we actually are validated by Salesforce InfoSec. And it's a very time-consuming code review. We have to do interviews on InfoSec. There's specific security standards that we have to adhere by. And it's also done by DevSecOps inside of Salesforce, and we meet all of NIST. So the reason why this is important is when you're a native app, anytime Salesforce is doing a big release, which, for example, they just did, we have to go through this validation with them. If you're not a native app, you don't have to do this. You can just throw your stuff up on the App Exchange without that native symbol, that little native badge. And at that point, you're kind of on your honor, number one. And number two, there's really no policing of, how secure your app is or isn't. Ergo, you're on your honor. While that may not sound like a big deal, InfoSec teams typically internal to customers and prospects have a big problem with that because there's no real accountability and there's no adjudication of your code unless, again, you're completely native to Salesforce, if that makes sense again. So what does this mean? What this means is that when you're completely native, you have better data accuracy and relevance. It means you have better identity management. You are now creating applications using clicks, not code, which again is the whole reason why you have applications and platforms like Salesforce. You want to put power in the hands of the developer. One of my favorite quotes is, you turn off the developer these days and you turn off the world. The developer kind of makes the world go round. And so you also have citizen developers, again, that will want to come in and change things or add their 2 cents because they're consuming. And that's where the clicks really matter in a native environment. It also means you have way better performance because, again, as you saw in the slide earlier, this is a native application that goes right against the Salesforce runtime, instead of having 4 or 5 different pieces of code running that are loosely coupled together. This also means you don't have to worry about things like disaster recovery. You don't have to worry about things like high availability. This is all done inside of the Salesforce cloud. So your DevSecOps pipes for Salesforce essentially are very tightly coupled to Salesforce, which is the ideal thing. It also means you have better dev and release velocity, and you have decreased operational issues at the end of the day. So I always talk about the anti-patterns because I am somewhat of a technical guy, and some of the anti-patterns to having a non-native solution are inherently, because it's not native, you have more complexity. That comes in the form of APIs. You have to keep those up as a vendor. It comes in the form of having to open IP addresses and thereby opening back doors. It also means that you're kind of, relying on the vendor for, uptime, performance, and high availability. Typically what we find is that they're a lot longer to implement and realize value. They tend to be costly, and I'm not just talking about the soft costs of the tool. I'm talking about also the hard costs in terms of deployment time, problems with adoption inside of DevSecOps. I'm talking about things that are costly in terms of data being shared by third parties. And what I mean by that is we have some customers that have replatformed because they have discovered that their data is actually being seen by third-party contractors that a vendor in this space has hired. Well, that might not seem like a big deal, but when you're supposed to not have that happen because that data is sensitive and it might be a particular geography's citizen data, you run into trouble with that pretty quickly, which dovetails into now you're out of compliance. And again, this whole thing about not being native means Salesforce as a platform is not vetting you. They're not adjudicating your processes. They're not adjudicating your security. They're not adjudicating your internal development hygiene. We talked a little bit about why backdoors are bad. Ultimately, what you don't want to have happen is a loss of control of your own information, which is what happens 99.99999% of the time unequivocally when you go with a non-native app. When you don't go with a native app, you will invariably have to move your data outside of Salesforce, which again, I'm pretty passionate about. It just opens up a whole lot of can of worms for folks. The other thing that happens when you have a non-native app is what we find in DevSecOps pipes and in the overarching process is with a non-native app, you're typically finding the bug very close to or at release versus very early in conception and design. And the Ponemon Institute did a study and found that when you find bugs in conception and design, it's typically $80 to fix and kind of remediate that. Whereas what we also find when we visit with prospects and customers, especially people that have deployed some of those other guys, is they're spending anywhere between $5,000 and $8,000 trying to refactor a bug that's now out in production. And so that causes a lot of nightmares, not just economic ones. It causes loss of sleep for the devs, the release managers. It causes loss of productivity, and it just kind of gives the whole DevSecOps, I would say, pattern or the pipe just a bad name. And so again, you just invariably will end up creating more chaos and entropy, with regards to trying to refactor, do rollbacks, and fix these bugs in a non-native app. It's just considerably more difficult to do all that. So let me kind of end this by giving you some questions to ask. So you should be asking when you're looking for a solution, in our space, is this really native? Are you just saying you're native, or do you actually have the native badge? Do you have a backdoor that you create? Everybody's going to say no, but you should ask them, am I going to have to open IP addresses, inside of my org, for you to interact with my Salesforce instance? You should ask about the fact that, do you move my data to your own inherent platform? How do you actually do what it is that you do outside of, seeing a demo with, a slick UI? You should ask, what other platforms and solutions have access to my data? More importantly, who has access to my data? Who are those people as well? Where's my data going? I would also ask, is this a simple UI, or is it just a flashy UI? What are the change management implications like, and what is your adoption like? The other question I would ask is, are you a Salesforce partner? There are vendors out there today in our space that are not even Salesforce partners. And the last two are super important. I would ask, is it built 100% inside of Salesforce? And it's really simple. Will parts of your solution work if Salesforce goes down? If the answer to that is yes, they will, then they're not a native application. And that's why native matters. Now with that, I'll pause and take any questions if there are any, Haley.
Sure thing. So I am Haley Smith. I'm a marketing manager at Flowsome, and I have been listening in and collecting a few questions that we are going to answer live. And then if we weren't able to cover one of your questions during this webinar, or it's very specific to you, we'll reach out afterwards and make sure it gets taken care of. So the first question that I have is asking if native apps are generally more expensive.
So that's a really great question. Native apps are not expensive. They may seem expensive optically when you try to compare them against some of these non-native applications. I would like to say that we are actually very cost competitive. But then there's what I call the opportunity cost of going with a non-native application. And we talked a lot about that. Things like downtime, things like adoption of the overarching solution. In many instances, one of the things that we've observed is that your release velocity slows down considerably after deploying a non-native solution because of all the moving pieces and complexity. So, you can definitely go and buy a cheaper solution, which may seem cheaper in terms of license costs, perhaps, But you're not really going to get anything beyond what you're paying. If anything, again, I have another customer that actually had their release velocity slow down considerably because of the complexities of going non-native. So, I think that native applications are just way more efficient, way more streamlined, and ultimately will save you a lot more money. Typically for us, for example, when we compute ROI for our customers, our payback is less than 2 months. So that's how I'll answer that one, Haley.
Awesome. Okay. So the next question we have is saying, aren't there some companies that have a native badge on the App Exchange, but aren't completely native?
So they say that they're native. They won't have the native badge. The only way you get the native badge is by truly being native. They will put in their descriptions, that, oh, we're a native solution, we're native this. Just because you put the word native doesn't make you native. Salesforce has to give you that little cloud native badge in order for you to be native. So don't be fooled. At this point, we're the only vendor out there that is truly native and that can bring you all the value that we've discussed, as well as the risk mitigation and compliance that we've discussed.
Awesome. Okay. So the next question is, can you still get data in real time with a non-native app, or is there some sort of lag?
So there's two ways to answer that. The first way to answer that is, can you get real-time data with a non-native app? Would depend on your definition of real-time. The short answer is it's very difficult to do that with a non-native app because you have a ton of API calls that you have to make. Salesforce has to do its security thing and then make sure that your API call, the way that you're making it, is well formed. And then it has to go and turn and make a call to the database, get the data, package it, and then send it back to you. So absolutely, there's a lag. That might not seem like a big deal, but when you're doing tens of thousands of API calls in a day, that becomes a real problem. And if anything, it also leads to performance issues on the Salesforce side of things, and your environment can get really laggy and boggy. So, it's not a best practice is what I would say.
Okay. And I believe this is going to be our last question. How does non-native lead to decreased operational limits that you mentioned earlier? Could you explain that a little more?
Oh, absolutely. So when you don't have a native application, you are going to have a whole bunch of different components that are going to try to work with each other that inherently weren't designed to work with each other. And so you have all these, think of these moving gears that you are brute forcing together into a solution. Now, the problem with that is you won't get the release velocity that you're looking for because there's always going to be problems. I have another customer today that was able to achieve some pretty cool upper thresholds with a competitor of ours, and I respected that. Where they found themselves in trouble was they had a ton of bugs that they introduced into production because they were doing things at lightning speed. And the QA and check process wasn't well formed. The problem is that once they had that and they released all this stuff into production, they weren't able to roll it back cleanly. And so, that's a really great example of an operational limit where, you thought you were doing something great and you pushed a whole bunch of stuff out only to realize that a lot of it had bugs in it, errors. And now you can't cleanly roll it back. And so, when they discovered things like that, they very quickly jettisoned that platform and came to Flowsome. So, there's also economic limits, that are operational in nature. So in this instance, it costs a lot of money for them to essentially have to go back and undo all this mess that, they invariably inadvertently created. So, those are just a couple of quick examples from, from me in terms of, what we're talking about with regards to decreased operational limits.
All right. So that is the last question we're going to take. Thank you, Ankur. I do have a couple more points to make just before we close out the webinar. All right, so we will be following up with any outlying questions. So if you did not get your question answered, don't worry about that. We'll follow up with you. And we'll also be sending out the recording to all registrants. So, anyone who had to drop, they will receive the recording. And then anyone on the call right now will still also receive that recording. So to keep an eye out for an email. It will be in your inbox within 24 hours. Other than that, thank you for joining us. We hope that you found this information really informative, and keep an eye out for an invitation to our next webinar in the series, which is going to focus on data integrity. That's all for today. So everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.